Hello, just a quick message before the show starts. This is a slightly extended episode because we have a guest on the podcast, Dr. Karin Nordin, which I'm super excited about. We're talking about New Year's resolutions, and I did want to just give you a quick heads up that we will be talking about some weight loss issues. So if that's triggering for you or anything, I wanted you to know in advance. We do relate it back to how you can take those lessons and apply them to more academic activities, but just wanted to let you know that there will be some discussion of healthy weight loss in the episode. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of the PhD Life Coach. And I am super excited because today we have with us Karin Nordin, who is a behaviour change expert and is going to be talking with us about New Year's resolutions. So hi Karin, welcome.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here.
We are super glad to have you here. So for all of you listening, if you're not familiar with Karin's work, I've been following her for a while now. And one of the reasons I wanted to have her on the show was because she's just this amazing combination of scientific and evidence-based, which as an ex-professor, I love. So she brings all this evidence base to it, but she makes it really fun and engaging and is really compassionate too, which I find really important. As an ADHD, I'm not good when people are saying you must be super consistent all the time and so on. And so her approach has been really valuable for me. And so I wanted to get her on the show. And I am super glad that you're able to be here. Maybe you can start just by telling us a little bit about yourself. And as last week's podcast, well, the podcast before Christmas, last week when we were recording this, was about the importance of doing things outside of work. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the fun stuff you do outside of work too.
Sure, yeah. So like you said, hi, my name is Karin. I have my PhD in a field called health communication, which is the study of health behavior change and how we communicate in a way that helps people change health behaviors. A lot of the original research there was surrounding tobacco, smoking cessation, those kind of like large public health issues. But a lot of the work that I did with my own dissertation was more around the educational side of things. So I studied growth mindset, self-efficacy. I did some work on public speaking anxiety, actually. And so that's where my research half of me is from. And I will tell you this, since I think it will benefit all of you who are listening to this podcast, is that I had no plans of starting my own business after graduating. I was a PhD student. I started doing some contracting for a company that created nutrition coaching certifications for people. And I got certified because it was free through them. And it all kind of spiraled from there. So now I am the full-time CEO of Body Brain Alliance. We have coaching and education in hopes of getting compassion first change education into the lives of 1 million people. That is our mission statement. And it's funny you ask about the personal side of things, because one thing that I'm very much working on right now is getting outside of work, having tight boundaries around my life as a CEO, which is very difficult to do. And so I just did my first powerlifting meet, and I am considering next year running a half marathon. So that's something that I will be working on as well.
Exciting. Fantastic. And thank you for taking the time to tell a little bit about your journey. So with PhD Life Coach, our listeners are mostly PhD students through to senior academics. There's a few other people who listen along too, but it's mostly that sort of audience. And so I think hearing these different routes you can take is super important. So we're really thinking New Year's resolutions is coming around to that sort of time. What do you see people get wrong? Why don't people stick to their New Year's resolutions?
Yeah, so I think there's really three main things that people get wrong. Number one, I was just talking about this to our coaching clients this morning, is that a lot of people create their New Year's resolutions during like the last couple of weeks of December from a place of self-hate, or honestly from a place of being triggered, right? So we go to places for the holidays, we're around our parents, we're around our like childhood house, or, you know, whatever you might end up doing, but you go to this place, you're seeing people you haven't seen in a while, and you start to have all these thoughts about yourself, right? About who you are, about what you need to do differently. And we can set this resolution from this very negative place of like, I need to fix myself, something's not working, I'm broken. And I always tell our clients, don't set a goal or a resolution in this case from a place of disempowerment. You want to set a resolution or goal from a place of empowerment. So I think that's one thing that people do wrong, because then, of course, if every time you are pursuing your goal, it reminds you of everything that's like, quote, wrong with you, according to your brain, then no wonder you're going to abandon it, because you're trying to get away from those thoughts. So that's number one. Number two is that people don't ask themselves if they actually want to do the process or the work of the resolution as well as the result. So when I was thinking of running a half marathon, I talked to my coach about it. And before we solidified that as a goal, she really asked me, she was like, I want you to think about what that's going to entail. I want you to think about scheduling in time for long runs. I want you to think about the fact that you're going to be more tired on run days, and how is that going to affect your work? And like, do you really want to do the work? Do you want to go on the journey as well as achieve the result? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, and this is pretty general, but people do not have a concrete sense of social support. So a lot of people don't have a coach. They don't have someone in their corner they can talk to about personal development or self-improvement. And we know from tons of research that one of the main drivers of health behaviors and sustainability in health behaviors is social support. So putting yourself around other people who are also pursuing new things, or getting your partner on board, or all those types of things, can be really helpful.
Love. And yeah, totally resonate with so much of that, particularly the coming at it from a point of trying to fix yourself. That was something that I really, really struggled with over the years. I've got somewhat better at it, but yeah, I think that's a really important one to remind everybody about. Well, for everyone listening, no, we're going to actually do this call slightly differently than you might think. This isn't just going to be hints and tips, because we thought it might be best for you guys to actually see this stuff in action. Because often you can hear people talk through, oh, you need to do this and don't do this. And yeah, you can try and, implement that yourself. And I know you're really big on how to implement things. But what we're going to do in this episode is you're actually going to help me figure out my New Year's resolutions. So I've given you a little bit of a heads up of the types of things that I'm thinking about and some of my bad habits, but I'm sure they will come up as we talk. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah.
And you are now in charge. And I'm slightly scared and very excited.
Yeah. So let's start with, like, do you have any ideas right now? Like, what are your general thoughts about what has popped up, things you might want to pursue next year? Where are you at?
So my usual thing is having about 57 million things and trying to figure out ways to make the resolutions cover all of them. So knowing that I need to narrow down, I'd say there's a kind of health related goal. I'm heavier than I was. And whilst from a kind of body confidence point of view, I'm actually pretty good, that it doesn't bother me from that perspective. But I do circus, I do aerial silks, and the fact is, the heavier you are, the more you've got to carry up those silks. And I'm also getting married in July, and at the moment my dress doesn't fit, which is a sort of concrete goal, I guess.
So tell me a little bit more about what's driving that. So you said you want to fit into your dress and you're doing aerial silks, right? But like, when you got the idea of like, maybe I want to try to lose weight next year, when did that happen?
Yeah, it's been a gradual thing, I guess, because the weight's gone on gradually. It's not a sudden, like I've suddenly put on loads of weight. Some of it, I turned 45 this year, and there's an element of I want to die just yet. And so that kind of suddenly realizing, oh man, you're actually getting a little bit old and probably need to think about these things comes into it too. So I'm not sure there was a specific moment, probably same as a lot of people, the weight mostly went on during the pandemic, when I suddenly realized I wasn't walking around campus all the time and so on. So it's that sort of gradual realization, and then feeling it every week when I try and climb up the silks.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, how do you think you'll feel when you lose weight? What will be different?
So like I say, I'm not somebody who's kind of like, I'm going to be loads more attractive, I'm going to be loads happier. I don't believe that. I think I'll be proud of the fact that I've managed to stick to it, if you see, more than the actual thing. I don't think I'll be proud that I weigh a certain amount, but if I stick to this, because sticking to goals has always been a challenge for me, although I have usually achieved quite a few things, so not necessarily, but sticking to them in a kind of consistent, the way I planned it way has always been a challenge. So I think I'll be proud of that. It will be nice if my wedding dress does up, but I mean, I guess a seamstress can deal with that if necessary. And circus wise, there's just a whole bunch of moves that I'd love to be able to do, and I know I'll be super happy if I can do those, because they're just fun and look cool.
And you said like you'll be proud that you were able to stick with it. What is it?
Whatever process I decide that I need to do in order to actually lose the weight, if you see what I mean. So that kind of, losing the weight's the one I've always been able to kind of wing stuff. So you were talking about like half marathons and things. I've run 6 or 7 half marathons. I've never trained properly for any of them. But the fact is, if you just kind of do a little bit of running and then get there and wing it and stay enthusiastic, you get around one way or another, which is mostly how I've done them over the years. Similarly, writing goals. I mentioned to you before the call that I'm also writing a children's novel, which I quite like to finish next year too. And that's why I can blitz it. It's fine. But you can't blitz weight loss. So I feel like weight loss is quite a good goal for me, because it's one where I'm going to have to actually learn some strategies where I'm not going to use the word consistent because that's an unrealistic goal for me, but where I can stick to a sort of an approach in the longer term, because I can't blitz it.
Yeah. And I'm curious about this idea of like sticking to something. So let's say that you come up with some sort of like diet protocol, and let's say you absolutely do stick with it, and you stick with it for 90 days and you don't lose any weight. How would you feel? This
is the point where my client brain and my coach brain kind of go, because my coach brain is like, no, I would be super proud of myself that I've stuck to it. And I think that is partly true. I think I would also be frustrated, because I think not so much because I wouldn't be lighter, but because I think I would be telling myself that I'd done something wrong. Because if I've stuck to it for 90 days and I haven't lost weight, then I stuck to the wrong thing. And I suspect, as much as my coach brain likes to think I wouldn't, I suspect my real human brain would be beating myself up for not having picked the right thing in the first place.
So I asked you that question just because I think it's important when we're doing resolutions and we're setting goals to figure out like, what is the real underlying driver of the goal? And so I think for you, it sounds like some of it is this idea of like sticking to something, right? But I also think there's something else there, because otherwise it would be like, oh, if I stuck to it, yeah, I'll be totally good as long as I stick to it. And you're saying that's not necessarily true, right?
Yeah, I guess the other thing, I do objectively want to be somewhat lighter than I am now, just because I've kind of, like I say, I'm now trying to put it into American numbers, 2 stone for British people, however much that is, 28 pounds, something like that, over where I used to be as an adult. And I just don't want that slippery slope. I don't want to be another stone heavier in 5 years and another stone heavier in 5 years, and that kind of, I don't want to accept that my body is middle-aged and gonna like drift into overweightness. So there is an actual objective. I would like my body to be strong and healthy and flexible and circusy.
Yeah. And so this is where I want to dig into, like, and if you're listening to this, I would encourage you to dig into like where the goal is coming from specifically. But I also want to dig into a little bit the idea of identity, right? So the next question I want to ask you is like, what right now is preventing you from losing weight? Like, what are the behaviors you're talking about, how you don't want to continually gain? What are the behaviors that are driving the weight gain?
They are a lack of organization. So just not having planned out what I'm going to eat, resulting in either not having the stuff in the house that I perceive I need to eat something healthy, or just therefore making a decision in the moment, and the healthy food that is in the fridge requires some preparation and some thinking about and some organization, versus just grabbing something like toast and lots of butter that's easy and immediately there. So I'd say mainly a lack of organization, because I've been working on the other side of things. But the other side of it is the sort of, oh, you deserve a treat sort of voice. And that's something that I've been working on in my own kind of self-coaching practice and things, is sort of working on that side. But yeah, most of it is just not having planned ahead and then making decisions from my less higher brain at the moment.
Yeah. Well, and I want to go into that for a minute, right? Because the reason that we like dive for those easy options, the reason that we don't make those decisions is because we're not supporting ourselves enough in terms of emotional regulation, maybe in terms of social support. And so anytime someone sets a goal, right, we want to try to trace it back to what are the actual behaviors right now that either are stopping you from having done this thing already or would stop you, and what is the actual root cause, right? Because you're telling me, okay, I want to focus on weight loss, I want to focus on sticking to a plan. But even if you stick to that plan for 90 days and you lose the weight, if you don't solve the underlying issue of caring for yourself and regulating your emotional needs, A, you're probably not going to be able to stick to that plan, right? And B, you're going to gain that weight right back.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we work on with clients is shifting avoidance goals to approach goals. And so an avoidance goal is like what we're trying to get away from. And weight loss is almost always an avoidance goal. Sometimes, though, we can flip it to approach goals by asking you, like, what are the behaviors that you actually want to enact in your life? Can we focus on those? And then can we let our body do what it's going to do? Because the reality is your body is out of your control, right? Especially as like a woman in like middle age, you would call it, right? Like there are all sorts of hormone fluctuations. There's a lot that's outside of our control. But what we can control here is our behavior, right? So what specific behaviors do you think your future self does who's able to, you know, go to circus and do all these crazy tricks and feel amazing and feel strong and healthy? Like, what is she doing?
This is so good. I know our listeners are going to be getting so much out of this. I think the main things is planning. That I think future me needs to just take a little bit of time to go, okay, what are you actually eating tomorrow? And
okay, hold on. I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there. Okay. Because I don't want to use a phrase. I don't want to use the word just, right? Because it's never just something. Even the way you just minimized that tells me that you haven't thought that that's a real obstacle for you. And we haven't thought enough about what that real obstacle is.
Yeah.
Right? So why is it that you struggle with planning ahead your food for the next day?
Partly, I think, because I usually overcomplicate it. So if I'm like, oh, I'm going to plan, suddenly the recipe books come out and, it's not necessarily sustainable. And again, that's something that I'm aware of and getting somewhat better at, but it is still there. Some of it is, I think, genuinely, I just rush from one thing to the next. And sometimes the next is messing around on social media. I'm not saying I'm productive all the time, but I think I just don't go, okay, right, 10 minutes, let's sit down. We'll work out what we're going to eat for the next couple of days. And I sort of go, oh, I'm going to do that now. I'm going to do it for, I'm going to stick to doing that. and then don't. It's reminding me a little bit of something I heard you talking about in one of your previous reels about increasing frequency before you expect consistency. And I think that's something I definitely do. It's like, right, I'm going to plan my meals now. I'm going to plan every meal and I'm going to do this forever sort of thing, rather than just going, okay, just sit down and plan the next one, Vicky. So I think I probably make it a big thing.
What I'm hearing from you too is like this hyper obsession on planning, but I would guess that your healthiest self is still making a different decision than your current self, even if she hasn't planned.
Yes. Yeah. I don't usually have an sort of easily grabbable option for when I'm about to make a bad decision. It's either I've planned and therefore I eat healthily, or I haven't and therefore I don't.
Well, okay. So I'm going to say two things. One, this is where I would really encourage you to work with a coach, because I'm even hearing you use language like good and bad, good food, bad food, right? Healthy, unhealthy. And that kind of language will derail your efforts every time, because it creates a guilt spiral. So until we neutralize food, we're not going to have a healthy relationship with food. And until we have a healthy relationship with food, we're not going to be able to change our weight, right? Unless it's like in a very disordered way. So that's where I would encourage you to like work with an actual health coach on that. But the second thing that I am noticing here that I want to point out is that for a lot of you, especially a lot of you listening, we want to think that change is about lining up good days. We want to think that change is about getting those days where you plan and putting enough days where you plan together in a row so that it starts to make a difference, because that is the way it's framed for us. But if you look at the difference between people who are successful in a certain area and people who aren't, what it really is about is it's really about what decision you make on your worst day. And it's about nudging that minimum baseline ever so slightly in a more empowering step, right? So for you, I would say like the number one thing you should focus on, just from like a nutrition coach standpoint, is probably at first increasing protein or increasing fiber, right? Those are the two things that are like the big levers that we like to pull. So then I would say like, okay, if you said your bare minimum is kind of like toast with butter, right? How can we turn toast with butter into toast with butter and turkey and a clementine?
Yeah.
What does that, like, what comes up when I say that?
I think what comes up, firstly, just how fascinating it is being a coach and still having stuff reflected back at you. So I hope everybody listening is recognizing how much, no matter how much training you have in this stuff, you still find yourself thinking and saying things. So I recently had a client say, should I be better at this by now? I feel like you're giving me loads of support, but I'm still thinking these things, and should I be better? And I think this is a wonderful example of how even when you've got lots of training in this stuff, you're still in your own head and being your own human. Makes a difference. Yeah, I think you're right. I think one swap I have made recently, which has helped quite a bit, is having takeout type food in the freezer, which is healthier and cheaper than getting an actual takeout. And that is working quite well. I had to fight the thoughts, yeah, but if you do that, you're not doing it properly, in order to do that. But that's actually working quite well. So having sort of little ready meals, because I find I don't go so crazy on portion control, and having normal size pizza instead of takeaway size pizza and those sorts of things. So I could see how that could also translate into the sort of thing that you're talking about, having those little swaps for the days when I haven't planned and just need something because I'm hungry and it's mealtime.
So there, I think you have like somewhat of a plan, right? I always tell people that weight loss is not a goal. Weight loss is a strategic byproduct of a different goal. And so I think for you, right, instead of focusing on the specific number or getting on the scale all the time or whatnot, what I would encourage you to focus on in this arena is specifically like, what are the habits of my healthier self? And how can I pick one little thing at a time that I want to implement in my life and chip away at it. And when I start to get it, you know, so it's a regular part of my life, so it feels a little bit easier, then and only then can I add like another tiny piece and start chipping away at something else. And eventually you will end up with a very different identity, because you will become a person who always has something in the freezer. You will become a person who has these like immediate go-tos that she leans on in these moments. And that person, her body may or may not look different, right? But I think you will be a lot happier with the result, because you will feel strong, right? There's body recomposition that I'm not even going to get into that happens like at maintenance level, right? There's all kinds of science behind that. And I think that's why I would encourage you to focus on those, the habit formation, the identity grasping, rather than a specific goal like weight loss.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I love that talk of, I've heard you talk before about identity and what would your future you say. I love that. And I'm just thinking, so for the people listening, we're usually we're talking in the academic realm, we're talking about, getting things done. But I think that idea of identity moving into, for example, being someone who writes. So a lot of my clients and a lot of the people that listen to the podcast have big writing goals and those sorts of things. And what I love is how the stuff you've talked me through today, you could really easily see how that could translate into a writing habit, for example, and becoming someone who writes regularly. And that not necessarily being the number of words you're going to do each week, which is what I've often seen people sort of set as their resolutions, how that could be more about what would a writer do? How would a writer behave?
Yeah. And I want to point out too, that a writer doesn't necessarily mean you write consistently at all. And so I think a lot of people, especially in the academic realm, hyperfixate on the idea of like, I'm going to work on my, like, even when I was doing my dissertation, I wanted to be like, I want to work 1 hour each day on my dissertation. And for me, that did not feel like a compassionate goal, because I am a cyclical person. I can go balls to the wall on something and then I'm going to completely be bored of it. And so I think like every goal is going to be coached a little bit differently, which is the power of coaching, right? And which is why I'm never like, oh, you should set goals this way, following this exact formula, because it's going to be different each time. And so for something like writing, my best advice is to let yourself be cyclical, to let yourself like, okay, you have a conference coming up, great. Book yourself a hotel room, go there for 4 days, do nothing else, and then return to your regular life. That's fine. But we have guilt around that because we're told that we should be consistent and that we should have this like daily tick, 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 and that it's somehow better. But I'm like, if the result is the same, like I have the same PhD as someone who wrote every day for a year, and I wrote my dissertation in like a 3.5 week, like crazy spree. So at the end of the day, work with yourself, not against yourself.
Yeah. I think that's great advice, because I think within that, there's also that thing of accepting that that's your approach, because what I see, and I saw in myself previously, but again, I've worked on quite a lot, is I'm very cyclical too. I can get a lot done in a really short amount of time when I'm on it. And I really used to beat myself up. And so whilst in the end, got the same PhD, got the same publications, all of those things, there was all this self-talk alongside it of, yeah, but you shouldn't do it like that. And that was the bit that made it painful. It wasn't actually the doing it in blitz sections that made it painful. It was the way that I was talking to myself about that. Right. And since I've been much more accepting of that's just kind of how I roll, then it's so much easier. I wonder what one of the things that I've been toying with, we've been talking in the previous episodes about focusing less on to-do lists and more on to think lists, and coming up with ideas that you want to remind yourself to think regularly. And I wondered if you had any perspectives on that.
From a research standpoint, our brain does like specifics. And so the problem with something like a to think list is that it doesn't have an endpoint. and there's no completion, there's no done. And so if it's empowering for you to go down that road, that's fine. But I would say for a lot of the clients we work with, it would probably be very paralyzing to have something on their list that they couldn't cross off, right? I think the way that I would shift at is one of the tools that I use is time blocking. And I will, before I start a big project, I will block myself time specifically to think about that. So I'll be, okay, I'm going to give myself an hour or like 2 hours on Tuesday where I'm just going to brainstorm ideas for this project. I'm just going to look into things. So it's not even that I'm starting the project. It's almost like I'm boarding the plane that's going to take off, right? So that's just like my first thought that comes to mind is I would just be careful with something like that, because you can get really, really lost in that and spend a lot of time thinking and then nothing ever gets done. And you convince yourself, oh, I'm thinking, but action isn't happening.
Oh, absolutely. I guess I'm not thinking about spending lots of time thinking. So I have Post-its and things like that. So one for me is one thing at a time. So that's one of my to thinks is one thing at a time, because my tendency is to go, I need to do this and this and da-da-da. And it's like, well, if I'm going to eat healthily, then I need to work out my exercise plan. If I'm going to have an exercise plan, then I need to fit in walking the dog and da-da-da-da-da. And so having that one thing at a time. So it's more of a kind of thought that I return to, I guess, when I hear my brain going off on one, rather than setting aside a period of time for thinking.
And I think that gives your brain something very intentional to focus on, right? Because I'm going to pick on you for a minute, but one of the things I've noticed on this call is that several times you have spent time describing to me how you are. You're like, I'm like this. I do things this way. I'm very blah, blah, blah. And I have ADHD too. And I hear this from a lot of ADHDers. What we will do is we will over-explain our behavior. We're like, oh, I have ADHD, so I'm like this. So I operate this way. So I'm always on 100 things at once. And what that can turn into is both a fixed mindset and a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because we tell ourselves, I'm this way. And so we are completely blind to any evidence of when we're not acting in that way. And we're telling ourselves that if that's something that we want to change or alter, we can't do anything about it, right? So before this year, I very much had a narrative of like, I always want to focus on 1,000 things at once. I have to have a bunch of different goals, otherwise I get bored. And this year I said, you know what? That may be how Karin was, but that is not how Karin is anymore. And so I'm going to choose to believe that I'm an essentialist. I'm going to choose to believe that I go all in on something that's really important to me. And if you look at this year, that's exactly what I did. I picked 3 goals. I have been all in on those goals all year long, and I have not been distracted by anything else. And it's purely because I allowed myself the opportunity to believe that about myself instead of grasping tightly to my safe old identity of this is how I operate.
I love that. Yeah. And I can really see that in myself and how that manifests. And in fact, people have said, yeah, but you've got so much done. You can't be someone who doesn't get things done. So yeah, I think that's really, really useful, and such a useful thing for everybody listening to think about. What messages do you have about yourself that you just believe are just true and that might be standing in the way of your resolutions and things?
And how are you describing yourself to other people is really important too, right? Because what we say to other people is they then expect that of our behavior. So I'll give you an example. When I started my PhD, I was moving in with 3 like guys that I sort of knew. They were like in my department and they had an extra room. So I was like, sure, I'm going to live with you. Great. And they had reached out to me, and I was living in Alabama at the time. I was moving to Virginia for grad school. And they were like, hey, we were just wondering like what you need for your first week, like what your schedule is going to kind of be so that we can figure out stuff with like the house. And I told them, I was like, no problem. I was like, I work out a lot. I eat a lot of protein. And so the thing I'll need is like, I'll need a lot of space in the fridge for all that protein. And if you want to come to the gym with me, I'll be going to the gym every morning. Was I going to the gym every morning? No. Was I someone who ate a lot of protein? No. But I absolutely set that expectation. I started telling them that I was that person. And so when I got there, I had no choice but to follow that. And so instead of going into the new year, like reinforcing all these things about your past self, can you start talking about the self that you want to embody as if that person is already here, as if you already believe that? Because there are studies that show that it is not our mindset about a trait, nor is it like our self-efficacy about a trait that helps us like actually get that. It is essentially pretending, it is putting ourselves in a situation where we're forced to embody that trait.
Love. Let's finish. You mentioned your half marathon. What are your resolutions? How are you like embodying that?
Yeah, so I actually don't have them completely figured out yet. I try to avoid solidifying anything until January, just because I know that I am also a person with lots of ideas. And so I'm going to have lots of different ideas. So I don't know currently what they are going to be. I do know that I am signed up for a half marathon in March, and I am signed up for another powerlifting meet in April. So I will be doing a lot of like cross training for both at the same time, which will be exciting for me in the first quarter. But beyond that, I'm not totally sure what the rest of mine are going to be quite yet.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. Before we finish, you just want to take a second to say that people can find you on social media and so on if they want to find out more.
Yes, absolutely. So I have 3 things that I'm going to tell you about really quick. Number 1 is we have a future self mapping mini course. It's completely free, and it helps you identify your core 4 values and your core 4 habits that you can focus on in order to become your 2.0 self. So if you're feeling a little bit directionless, that's a really great place to start. Plus it's free. So it's honestly the best place to start. The second thing I will tell you about is I have a monthly membership. It is $35 a month, and it is called Change Academy. I do a 2-hour deep dive workshop on the science behind a specific change topic every single month. So I would highly encourage, that's kind of the entry point for a lot of people for us. And we have an online community. You can like meet other people who are using the same goals as you. We do pop-up accountability events. We do like Tidy with me, that kind of thing. So it's a fun place to be. And then I'm not sure what the availability will be when this airs, but we do at least currently have 2023 coaching spots open in Alliance Coaching. Like I said, I'm not totally sure. We usually do sell out, but check our website, and worst case scenario, you can put yourself on the wait list. And if that's for someone, you know, if you're really looking for radical self-transformation, that is what I would go for. So
amazing. And I will put links to all this stuff and to your Instagram and your YouTube and everything in the show notes. So thank you so much. You've given me so much to think about. If you're listening, I would really recommend that you go back to the beginning of this episode and listen to the questions that Karin asked me and answer them for yourselves. Because when you're listening to somebody else getting coached, it's really easy to get caught up in the story of me and my weight loss. But go back and listen to those questions and see if you can answer them in relation to your own goals, because I know you will get tons out of it, just as I have.